Welcome to Silent Queen's Calling. I'm so glad you're here. Now, let's get into the story. The pharmaceutical heir drove his custom Bentley Bentayga up the cracked driveway of a crumbling New England farmhouse, carrying a $75,000 settlement check and his 24-year-old girlfriend draped in Bulgari diamonds. He had come to humiliate his ex-wife into signing away her name on a patent sheet, never really understood anyway. He expected to find her broken, weathered, maybe a little desperate. Instead, the quietly composed woman who opened the warped wooden door had spent the last 4 years transforming that sagging farmhouse into a $12 million private research compound, and had already sold the molecule he thought he owned to a Swiss biotech firm for $3.1 billion, effective that morning. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 1. The Bentley in the driveway. Reginald Ashford parked the Bentley with the practiced arrogance of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved nice things. He stepped out onto the uneven gravel, adjusted the lapel of his cashmere sport coat, and surveyed the property with the satisfied squint of a man arriving to collect a debt. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long tree-lined drive in Woodstock, Vermont, a shingled colonial built in 1887 that had been sagging at the roofline when Reginald had signed it over to his ex-wife, Dr. Imogen Ashford, as part of their divorce settlement 3 years ago. He had given it to her instead of liquidity because his attorneys had appraised it at $340,000 in its current condition, and because the look on Imogen's face when she'd accepted the deed, quiet, unreadable, neither grateful nor bitter, had unsettled him in a way he hadn't been willing to examine. Standing beside him, scrolling aggressively through her phone with one thumb, was Tatum. Tatum was 24. She was a lifestyle content creator whose primary professional skill was photographing her own face at flattering angles. She wore a belted ivory trench coat, enormous vintage sunglasses, and 3-inch heeled boots that were actively being destroyed by the wet gravel. "Reggie," Tatum said, looking up from her phone with her mouth slightly open in performative disgust. "This is literally in the middle of nowhere. There's no signal. I have 0 bars." "It won't take long," Reginald said. "There are chickens," Tatum said. "Like free-range chickens just walking around." Reginald didn't answer. He was already moving toward the front porch, his leather Oxfords crunching on the gravel, who had rehearsed this particular victory in his head a dozen times on the drive up from Boston. He and Imogen had been married for 9 years. They had met during her postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School, where she was the quietest, most methodical scientist in a department full of people who confused loudness with intelligence. Reginald had been attracted, initially, to her precision, to the way she approached every problem with the stillness of someone who already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. He had been the money. His family, the Ashfords, had controlled a mid-size pharmaceutical distribution company for 3 generations. He'd had the capital, the connections, the boardroom fluency. And Imogen had had something far rarer, a genuinely novel idea. She had spent 6 years quietly developing a targeted molecular compound she called Veridine, a precision delivery platform that could theoretically reduce chemotherapy side effects by 70% by shepherding medication directly to malignant cells and bypassing healthy tissue entirely. In the early years, Reginald had bankrolled her lab. He'd been proud of her, in the way that certain men are proud of things they believe they own. Then the company began attracting real money. Board members, institutional investors, consultants with MBA degrees and opinions about market positioning. And somewhere in that transition, Reginald decided that Imogen, who still wore her hair in a plain braid, who preferred reading primary literature to attending galas, who had once left a black-tie dinner at the Four Seasons because she'd had a hypothesis she needed to write down before it left her, was no longer the right partner for the life he was building. The divorce had been swift and surgical. His attorneys had buried Imogen in paperwork. She had taken the farmhouse, a modest alimony arrangement, and her personal research journals. She had not fought for equity in Ashford Biodistribution. She had not hired competing counsel. She had simply reviewed the documents herself, made 2 quiet amendments that his team had nodded through without reading carefully, and signed on the line. Reginald had interpreted this as defeat. Now, 3 years later, standing on the porch of what he expected to be a moldering monument to her diminished circumstances, he raised his fist and knocked. There was a long pause. Wind moved through the sugar maples, lining the drive. A brown hen walked calmly across the porch and regarded him without alarm. Then the door opened. Imogen stood in the doorway. She was 41. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, and she was wearing a simple charcoal merino pullover, dark linen trousers, and no jewelry whatsoever. Her face was clear and calm, and her gray-green eyes registered his presence the way a chess grandmaster registers an opponent's opening move, with patience, with complete information, and with absolutely no surprise. "Reginald," she said. Her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had not raised it in years. "I don't recall scheduling anything." "This won't take long," he said, already reaching for the black portfolio tucked under his arm. "We need to talk about Veradine." Imogen's gaze slid past him to Tatum, who was picking her way across the gravel with her arms slightly out for balance, phone raised, apparently attempting to find a signal by holding it toward the sky. "Is she with you?" Imogen asked. "That's Tatum." A pause. "I see," Imogen said, in the tone of a woman who understood a great many things that she was choosing not to say. She stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." Chapter 2. The compound. Reginald crossed the threshold, expecting peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture, and the ambient sadness of a woman living beyond her means in a house too large for her grief. He had played this scene out in his imagination often enough that he'd begun to mistake the fantasy for a prediction. The entryway was deliberately unremarkable. Original wide plank floors, slightly scuffed, a simple wooden coat rack, a pair of muddy Blundstone boots near the door, a worn wool blanket folded over a chair. The plaster walls were bare and a little uneven. Tatum immediately wrinkled her nose, but Imogen led them not toward the original front parlor, where a stranger might expect to find her living, but down a long interior corridor toward the back of the house. The corridor was dim, lit by pendant lights with amber-tinted bulbs, and the walls here were clean white plaster, smooth and freshly done. The corridor ended in a door. Imogen opened it. Reginald walked through, and the world he had constructed, the story he had been telling himself for 3 years about who had won this divorce, quietly disintegrated. The back half of the farmhouse had been completely reimagined. A full-scale private research laboratory occupied what had once been a barn structure connected to the main house, now seamlessly integrated behind the original facade through a dramatic structural renovation. The ceilings were 14 feet high, supported by exposed Douglas fir beams and fitted with full-spectrum task lighting. The floors were polished industrial concrete, spotless. Along the north wall ran a custom-built bench system in matte white composite, outfitted with centrifuges, a biosafety cabinet, precision analytical balances, a 80 degrees Celsius freezer, and 3 linked mass spectrometers that together cost more than most people's homes. Beyond the lab, through a wall of interior glass, was a second space, a long reading room lined floor to ceiling with built-in bookshelves in pale ash wood, containing what appeared to be a complete private scientific library supplemented with climate-controlled archival storage units. In the center of this room sat a single long table in book-matched walnut, surrounded by low ergonomic chairs and illuminated by a skylight that ran the full length of the ceiling. On the far wall of the reading room hung a single piece of art. It was a large-scale black-and-white photograph of a strand of DNA, printed on archival cotton and mounted without a frame directly to the plaster. Underneath it, in small hand-lettered text, was a line from Barbara McClintock. "If you know you are on the right track, if you have this inner knowledge, then nobody can turn you off." Reginald stood very still. "You renovated," he said finally. It was not the sentence he had planned to say. "I did," Imogen confirmed. She moved to a small kitchen nook at the edge of the lab and filled an electric kettle from a brushed steel tap. The kitchen itself was compact but immaculate. A short run of soapstone countertop, a single induction burner, a small professional-grade refrigerator, and a ceramic pour-over setup next to a small electric roaster with a bag of green Ethiopian coffee beans. "This had to cost," Reginald started. "It did," Imogen said simply. Tatum had stopped just inside the doorway, her phone finally forgotten in her hand. Her eyes moved around the lab with the expression of someone who has wandered into a room where the rules are different, and she cannot identify exactly how. The Bulgari necklace at her throat, which had seemed so definitive in the Bentley, now looked like something purchased at an airport. "Please," Imogen said, gesturing to the chairs at the reading room table. "Sit down." Reginald placed the black portfolio on the walnut table. Imogen brought 3 ceramic mugs of green tea, set 2 in front of her guests without asking whether they wanted any, and sat opposite Reginald with the unhurried composure of a woman who had no reason to be anywhere else. "The Veradine patent," Reginald said, opening the portfolio and turning it to face her. "I need you to sign a supplementary assignment." Imogen wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at the documents without touching them. Ashford Biodistribution is finalizing a licensing agreement with Kellerman Pharmaceutical Group, Reginald continued. Slide the papers toward her. His voice had recovered its boardroom register, the practiced, slightly slowed cadence he used when he wanted to sound magnanimous. The deal is worth approximately $800 million over 10 years. Kellerman's due diligence team flagged an anomaly in the original IP chain. They want a clean, notarized confirmation that all rights to the Veridine molecular platform transferred to the company at the time of our divorce. Imogen looked at him. She said nothing. As a gesture of goodwill, Reginald continued, and here he reached back into the portfolio to produce a certified check, which he set at the edge of the table nearest her. I'm prepared to offer you $75,000 for the inconvenience. Tax considerations to be arranged at your end. Tatum, sensing that this was her moment, leaned forward. She picked up the check and held it out toward Imogen across the table, her wrist angled so that the Bulgari bracelet caught the light. It's incredibly generous, Tatum said, her voice carrying the bright, instructive tone of someone explaining something to a child. Most people in your position would be thrilled. You're living out here in the middle of Vermont on alimony. This is a real opportunity for you. Imogen looked at Tatum's hand. She looked at the check. She reached out and took it with the same calm she might use to accept a lab report, studied it briefly, and set it face down on the table. Then she looked at Reginald. You should have had someone read the original divorce agreement more carefully, Imogen said. Her voice remained perfectly level. Specifically, Schedule D, Attachment 7. Reginald frowned. We went through that agreement with 6 attorneys. 6 attorneys who specialized in marital asset division and did not have the scientific background to understand what they were reading, Imogen said. She stood and walked to a filing cabinet along the far wall of the lab, opened the second drawer, and removed a thin folder. She returned to the table and placed it in front of him. The Veridine compound, she said, was not a corporate asset at the time of our divorce. Chapter 3. The molecule. The folder contained 11 pages. Reginald picked them up with the hand of a man who had not yet registered that the room had changed temperature. On the first page was the cover sheet of a United States patent application. Filing date, March 2019. Applicant, Imogen Callaway, sole inventor, assignee, Callaway Scientific Ventures, LLC, a Delaware limited liability company. The patent number had been issued. The status field read. Reginald stared at the date. March 2019, 2 full years before their divorce. He looked up. You filed this under your maiden name. Callaway was always my professional name, Imogen said. You know this. Every paper I published used Callaway. My faculty affiliations, my NIH grants. She paused. Your attorneys were looking for IP assets under the name Ashford. They didn't find any, because there weren't any. Reginald's mouth opened slightly. The lab work was funded by Ashford Biodistribution. That makes any resulting intellectual property a corporate. No, Imogen said quietly. It doesn't. Not in this case. She reached across and turned to page 3 of the folder, where a highlighted section of the original research agreement was reproduced. This is the independent research carve-out clause that I added to my consulting arrangement with the company in 2018. Your legal team approved it. I needed it to maintain my academic standing and to ensure that foundational molecular research I conducted independently, before the company's formal R&D program was even established. Remained my property. She turned to another page. Veridine was conceived, designed, and first synthesized in my personal research capacity, before Ashford Biodistribution had an active drug development division. The company licensed a use right, a non-exclusive, revocable license, embedded in a research partnership agreement, in exchange for laboratory infrastructure support. She looked at him, which, as of 2 weeks ago, I formally terminated. Reginald set the papers down. There was a quality to his stillness now that was different from confidence. It was the stillness of a man watching a wall he believed to be load-bearing begin to lean. Kellerman's due diligence team, Imogen continued, her voice carrying no malice, only the clean forward motion of a woman completing a long equation, did not find an anomaly, Reginald. They found a hole, a foundational absence. Ashford Biodistribution cannot assign rights to Kellerman, because Ashford Biodistribution does not hold rights. What they have been operating under is a license that I terminated, which means the compound they built their entire oncology pipeline around is no longer available to them under any current legal instrument. Tatum set her mug down very slowly. Reginald pulled out his phone. His thumb moved fast, dialing, and he put it on speaker and set it flat on the walnut table, where it rang twice before a man's voice answered, strained, without preamble. Reginald. Tell me you're not in Vermont, Patrick. Reginald's voice had gone thin. I'm sitting here with Imogen. She's telling me the patent was filed independently. She's showing me a carve-out clause. Tell me our IP counsel already reviewed this and it's not what it looks like. A long exhale. We've been in an emergency review since Thursday when Kellerman's team flagged the chain of title. Reginald, the carve-out is real. We found the 2018 agreement in the archive. Our previous counsel noted it as a routine academic exception and did not flag the scope. A pause. The molecular synthesis records, the lab notebooks, the original filing, it all traces to Callaway Scientific Ventures, not to us. Then contest it, Reginald said. His voice had an unfamiliar quality, pressed, like something being squeezed. Challenge the carve-out. Challenge the filing date. On what grounds? Patrick said. She was operating as an independent researcher under a written agreement that our own company executed. There's no bad faith on her part. There's no misrepresentation. There's documentation at every stage. Another silence. Reginald, she owns the molecule. She always owned it. We had a license, and she pulled it. I have to be honest with you. Kellerman called me directly this morning. They're withdrawing the letter of intent. The reading room was absolutely quiet, except for the faint sound of wind in the sugar maples outside, and the very soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the lab wall. The licensing deal, Reginald said. Is gone, Patrick said. And Reginald, there's something else, because we've been representing to Kellerman that we hold clear title to Veridine throughout the due diligence process. Their attorneys are now assessing whether we made material misrepresentations. I need you to stop talking and call your personal counsel. Not company counsel, personal. A pause. I'm sorry, I have to go. The line went dead. Tatum had pushed her chair back from the table. She was looking at Reginald with an expression he had never seen from her before. Not anger, not sympathy, but the sharp, evaluative look of someone rapidly recalculating an investment. Wait, she said. The $800 million. Is that not happening? Reginald didn't answer. He was staring at the folder. Reginald. Tatum's voice rose by half an octave. We were supposed to close on the townhouse in Beacon Hill next month. The deposit check has already cleared. Tatum. I turned down a brand partnership with a skincare company to go full-time with you, she said. They wanted me for a 2-year contract. I said no because you told me we were going to be in a completely different financial bracket by Q1. This is not the moment, Reginald said through his teeth. Then when is the moment? Tatum demanded, standing up. Because right now I'm sitting in a barn in Vermont, and you're telling me an $800 million deal just evaporated because you didn't read a contract, and I'm wearing heels on gravel. Imogen watched this with the mild, removed interest of a scientist observing a reaction she had already modeled. She took a sip of her tea. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Patience. You want to know what I did wrong, Reginald said finally. His voice had dropped to something quieter and uglier than anger. He was looking at his own hands, flat on the walnut table. Tell me what I missed. Clearly, I'd rather not, Imogen said. Imogen. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set her mug down, folded her hands, and spoke with the patient, precise cadence she used when explaining something complex to someone who needed to understand it correctly. When Kellerman first approached Ashford Biodistribution 18 months ago, she said, a colleague forwarded me the press release. I had been watching your company's investor communications for some time. I understood what the Veridine pipeline was worth to a major pharma acquirer. Because I am the person who designed Veridine, and I understood its clinical potential before anyone at Ashford Biodistribution had a working definition of targeted molecular delivery. Reginald looked up at her. I did not want to disrupt the licensing process prematurely, Imogen continued. I needed Kellerman to complete sufficient due diligence to understand, independently, what they were actually buying. Because the moment their scientific team reviewed the compound's architecture in detail, which any competent pharma acquirer would do before committing $800 million, they would eventually reach the chain of title question. I simply ensured that when they arrived at that question, the documentation trail was clean, complete, and unambiguous. She stood and walked to the lab's interior glass wall, looking through it at the bench system, at the instruments, at the organized rows of labeled sample storage. I also, she said, made a phone call. To Kellerman, Reginald said quietly. It wasn't a question. To their chief scientific officer, Imogen said. 12 weeks ago, We had a professional acquaintance from her time at the Broad Institute. I reached out with a brief note flagging the independent research history of the Veridine compound, and offering to provide documentation if she felt it would be useful for their scientific due diligence. Imogen turned back to face him. She did. Tatum made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cry. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stared at the ceiling. You planned this, Reginald said. I planned nothing deceptive, Imogen said. I filed a patent on my own work, under my own name, in 2019. I negotiated a carve-out clause in 2018 to protect academic independence, something any research scientist employed by a private company should do. I terminated a license I had every legal right to terminate, and I made myself available to a potential acquirer who had legitimate scientific questions about a compound I invented. She looked at him steadily. What I did was exactly what you taught me, Reginald. I identified the leverage point. I waited for the optimal moment to exercise it, and I protected my position. He stared at her. You told me in the mediation room, Imogen said, that I had been useful, but that usefulness had an expiration date. You told me that you were the vision and I was the execution, and that the market rewards vision. She tilted her head slightly. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Imogen, he said, I will buy Callaway Scientific Ventures from you outright, right now. Whatever Kellerman was going to pay, I will personally guarantee you $50 million, $100 million. We can restructure this entire deal and both walk away solvent. Imogen's expression did not change. Kellerman's offer was not $800 million, Reginald. A silence. Their offer, she said, was to Callaway Scientific Ventures directly. I have been in active negotiation with their acquisition team for 11 weeks. The formal offer, which was accepted by my attorneys on Tuesday, is $3.1 billion in cash and stock. The room absorbed this the way a room absorbs something that cannot be unsaid. Reginald's face underwent a series of changes that happened too fast to be dignified. The certainty drained first, then the color, then something structural, the underlying architecture of a man who had organized his entire identity around the belief that he was the one who understood value, the one who knew what things were worth. Chapter 5. The Wire. They're not acquiring your company, Imogen said, delivering it simply without theater. They're acquiring mine. The $75,000 check on this table, she added, glancing at the folded paper near the edge, won't cover my attorney's dinner. Tatum stood up. She picked her coat off the chair with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who has decided that whatever is happening in this room is no longer something she is willing to be present for. She looked at Reginald with an expression that was not unkind so much as it was arithmetic. I need to think, she said. Tatum, I'm going to walk to the car. She looked at him for a moment longer, then looked at Imogen. Your house is actually very beautiful, she said without apparent irony, and then she turned and walked back down the corridor toward the front door. Her heels on the concrete were very loud, and then they stopped, and a moment later the front door opened and closed. Reginald sat alone across from his ex-wife in the reading room she had built, inside a farmhouse he had given her as a consolation prize. The afternoon light through the long skylight fell across the walnut table in pale, even bars. On the wall, Barbara McClintock's words stood in their small, permanent letters. I have investors, he said. His voice had reduced itself to something almost unrecognizable. I have a board. There are 200 employees at Ashford Biodistribution who will lose their positions if the company collapses. Imogen, I understand what I did. I understand that I undervalued you. I understand that I was wrong. He leaned forward. But please, a licensing arrangement, a fraction. Something I can take back to the board that allows us to continue operations. I am not too proud to ask you. Imogen regarded him. She had searched herself for this moment many times over the past 4 years. Sitting by the wood stove on winter mornings, running models in the lab, walking the property in the early light. She had wanted to know whether, when it came, she would feel the thing that movies had led her to expect. The hot, vindicating satisfaction of witnessed reversal, the gloating, the performance of power. She didn't feel any of that. She felt the clean, settled stillness of a mathematical proof that has been checked and verified. She felt the particular quiet of a life that has been rebuilt from its foundation in exactly the right materials, by someone who understood load and stress, and which walls were structural. I'm not going to offer you a licensing arrangement, she said quietly. Not because I want you to suffer, but because Callaway Scientific Ventures is no longer positioned as a licensor. As of Tuesday, I am joining Kellerman's executive team as their chief scientific officer for the oncology platform. The compound is going into phase 3 trials in the spring. She paused. What happens to Ashford biodistribution is a board-level question, and I don't sit on that board. Reginald closed his eyes. You should call your personal attorney, Imogen said, in a tone that was not cruel. Patrick was right about that. The material representation question is serious, and you'll want independent counsel before Kellerman's legal team formally initiates anything. She stood. You can let yourself out, she said. The door latches automatically. Mind the step at the bottom of the porch. The riser is 2 inches shorter than standard, and people catch it on the way down. She carried her mug back to the kitchen nook and began rinsing it. At the small, stainless sink. She heard Reginald's chair push back from the table. She heard his footsteps on the concrete floor, and then on the wooden floor of the corridor, and then the specific sound of the front door latch engaging, and then the house was quiet again, entirely her own. She finished rinsing the mug. She set it on the drying rack. She looked out the small kitchen window at the back meadow, where the afternoon light was turning the grass that pale gold particular to northern New England in autumn. A pair of cedar waxwings were moving through the old apple trees at the meadow's edge, quick and purposeful, entirely uninterested in anything except the work in front of them. Her phone, on the lab bench behind her, buzzed once. She dried her hands and went to it. The message was from her attorney. Wire confirmed. First liquid tranche cleared your account at 2:47 p.m. Welcome to the other side, Dr. Calloway. It's been a privilege. She read it twice, the way she read everything important. Then she set the phone back on the bench, pulled her notebook from the shelf above the centrifuge, and sat down on the lab stool to make notes on a question about cell membrane permeability that had been sitting in her mind since early that morning, patient and specific, waiting for her to have time for it. Outside, through the original farmhouse windows, she could hear the Bentley starting, the particular sound of that large, expensive engine turning over in the quiet Vermont afternoon. She heard the tires on the gravel. She heard it grow distant, and then there was only the waxwings, and the wind in the maples, and the faint, rhythmic sound of her own pen moving across the page. She had not come back to this house to wait for him to arrive. She had come back because the farmhouse had good bones, the land was quiet, and she had a great deal of work to do. The molecule didn't care who owned the rights to it. It cared whether it worked, and it did. She had known that in 2019, sitting alone at a second-hand bench in a rented space in Burlington. When the data had come back clean and she had sat very still for a long moment, not celebrating, just understanding, the way a scientist understands when something turns out to be exactly as true as you suspected. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date in the upper left corner, as she always did, and then she began. If this story stayed with you, if you recognize the woman who builds in silence while someone else takes credit, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The stories that matter are always the ones being written in rooms no one thinks to look inside.